Kahana is a pediatric gastroenterologist, and he's a certified clinical nutrition specialist who trained in Chicago, Israel, Minnesota, and UCLA. Dr. Kahana specializes in the relationship between food and chronic inflammation with an emphasis on obesity, the metabolic syndrome, non-alcoholic, and this is a tough one for me to say, I'm going to destroy it, but that's steatohepatitis, something like that. NASH, inflammatory bowel disease, food allergy, and sensitive, among others. Dr. Kahana's academic work and medical practice focus on preventive medicine and the integration of clinical nutrition with conventional therapy. Dr. Kahana has written several books, chapters for medical textbooks, and scientific articles on various topics. He is a member of nutrition companies and committees on the local and national levels, and is a volunteer medical consultant to nonprofit organizations, such as Crohn's and Colitis Foundation of America. And he has seen patients in the South Bay gastroenterology and is very excited to be part of our growing family-oriented community. Without further ado, let's please welcome Dr. Kahana.
All right, can you guys hear me? Thanks for having me. I'm really honored to present this topic to you, and especially in lieu of Dr. Tamkin's passing this recent year. And I didn't have a chance to meet him, but everyone I spoke with when I told them about today's lecture volunteered what an amazing person he was, what a wonderfully nice person he was, and what a pillar he served here in the medical community. He was a teacher and a friend to many. And I hope to teach you a little bit about some of these topics that I think are really evolving. And there's definitely going to be a lot of new information. So try to bear with me. I will show you some of the hard data, some of the science that's come out in the last few years. And also take you through some of the history. Because if there's one thing we know about nutritionism, it's really evolved. And what we know today will definitely debunk some of the myths of yesterday. So I'm going to introduce 3 root concepts. And a lot of the questions that I get asked by people are, well, bottom line, how should we eat? And what should we eat? And it's very difficult to answer that question. What I'm going to try to do is really introduce concepts that you can all take home and make that decision at your own dinner table. The first root concept has to do with feeding the fire. Turns out that much of modern nutrition isn't recognized by our body, by our immune system as food. It's recognized as foreign invaders. We're going to talk about how some food, the imitation food that has become quite prevalent in our table, turns on the inflammatory cascade, which causes chronic disease. The second concept I call fertilizing the weeds. And it has to do with the flora in the gut, and how the bacteria that live within us, that really outnumber us, the number of human cells is outnumbered 10 to 1 by bacterial cells, and how a state of eubiosis, good bacteria, and dysbiosis, bad bacteria, can really wreak havoc on our body. We're colonized by good bacteria, which prevent us from being colonized by bad bacteria. I'll introduce some concepts such as prebiotics and probiotics, which I'm sure many of you already know about. Lastly, I'm talking about starving the masses, or a concept that I like to call overfed and undernourished. We all know about the macronutrients. There's been a war about which macronutrients or how much fat versus carbs versus carbohydrates and protein should we eat. And what has been left behind is really the importance of the micronutrients, and not just the vitamins and the minerals, but also the trace elements, the phytonutrients, the phytochemicals that can fight disease and neutralize it before it starts. So the first concept, feeding the fire, I'll start by saying that this is something that has been really the dogma of modern nutrition. If you go to your doctor and talk to him or her regarding your nutrition, mostly you will hear eat less and exercise more. But nowadays we're realizing that to attribute obesity to overeating is as meaningful as to account for alcoholism by ascribing it to over-drinking. This is something that was said back in the 60s, but was reiterated by Gary Taub in a recent book that he wrote, Good Calories, Bad Calories. And I think it's really interesting that last week's Nobel Prize in Medicine was given to 3 researchers who delineated pathways of the innate immune system. So the innate immune system is that primitive immune system that is within all of us that's been conserved from plants to insects to mammals. And it's enabled us to really fend off invaders as the first line of defense. And the way that we activate the innate immune system is through these receptors called toll-like receptors. So Bruce Buehler won the Nobel Prize just last week, and so did Jules Hoffman, who really noted that it's a sensing mechanism. We almost taste our environment consistently and constantly. Metzetoff, in a 2010 Cell paper, called the system a system of inducers, which get picked up by sensors. These sensors, namely, are the toll-like receptors, also known as pattern recognition receptors because they sense patterns. Then through various mediators, some of them you know, interleukins, cytokines, tumor necrosis factor, create disease. So the question is, we now know what the mediators are. We certainly know what the disease is, right? Cardiovascular disease, stroke, atherosclerosis, cancer, diabetes. We know what the mediators are. We finally have discovered what the sensors are, just in the past decade or so. The question is, what are the inducers? Are the inducers just bacteria? Or can the inducers also be incorporated into industrial food and imitation food that we consume every day? So these are the toll-like receptors. We only know about 13 of them. 11 human, 2 that are in mice, so 13 in mice, 11 in human, and a lot of conservation between them. These pattern recognition sense conserved microbial structures or motifs that are in nature. And they are evolutionarily conserved from plants to insects to mammals. The 2 toll-like receptors that I will focus on the most are TLR2 and TLR4. TLR2 looks at things like lipoproteins from gram-positive bacteria or certain motifs from yeast, mycobacteria, and mycoplasm. TLR4 senses lipopolysaccharide, also known as endotoxin from gram-negative bacteria, as well as a bunch of other stuff, like RSV. And some of these TLRs, we don't even know what they bind. So what turns out is that we have a certain balance in our body, and that this immunological balance, or the balance of inflammation, rests on the immune system. And we have a system that allows us to repair our body, but if the balance is tipped the wrong way, it can result in injury. And what we're discovering is that this balance, or microbial signaling, is extremely important for maintaining this balance intact. So in the words of Ruslan Metzetoff in this same paper in Cell 2010, what he said is human cells deal with the various types of noxious conditions by inducing appropriate stress responses that ensure adaptation and survival in the face of an abnormal cellular environment. And adaptation requires changing the homeostatic set points to different values that are better suited to deal with the extreme or persistent abnormal conditions. We're living in abnormal conditions nowadays. And certainly today's food or environment is not the food or environment of our great-grandparents or a few generations earlier. So the question is, if we reset our set points to a higher inflammatory cascade, are we sensing the sensory overload that we're getting? Is it really good for our immune system, or is it creating chronic disease? In this study in 2006, she and his colleagues from Boston University, from Harvard University in Boston, looked at how free fatty acids, certain fatty acid motifs, engage these toll-like receptors. And what they noted is that certain free fatty acid motifs resemble bacteria through a classic case of molecular mimicry. And the activation of the immune response leads to tissue injury, fibrosis, and organ dysfunction, such as the ones I've mentioned. To show you some of the hard data, this is NF-kappa B, which is a universal transcription factor for inflammation. This is a negative control, which is bovine serum albumin. This is the free fatty acid that they tested, which was palmitic acid. And this is lipopolysaccharide, or endotoxin. These are vehicles, so that's the control. I want you to focus on the black bars, and you'll see that there is a dose response that's quite similar for free fatty acid as it is to lipopolysaccharide. Perhaps more interesting is this measurement of interleukin-6, also a marker of inflammation, and you see that saturated fats seem to exert a greater expression level of IL-6 than some of our friendlier polyunsaturated EPA and DHA, right, the fish fats that we all try to get as much as we can on. In a dose-response manner for tumor necrosis factor, we see that lipopolysaccharide and free fatty acid respond quite similarly. And lastly, if you co-incubate a saturated fat like C14 or C16 or C18 with DHA, you seem to aggregate the response. So maybe eating a little more omega-3s in a more proper ratio to the number of omega-3s, omega-6s, will actually neutralize some of the disease process. So we've actually known about this for a long time. We've known that certain mediators, like tumor necrosis factor, is related to insulin resistance. But you see, we note here that it's obesity-induced insulin resistance, and it's always been, well, if you just eat less, you won't get so insulin resistant. And we thought that obesity precedes insulin resistance. But this is something that's currently changing, and the paradigm is shifting, and we realize that maybe insulin resistance is actually driving obesity. Maybe that first hit isn't really overeating. And maybe all the people that have been blaming obesity on individuals not being able to get off the dinner table should go back to the data and reanalyze what they've been preaching all along. The people in the Southeast certainly aren't more gluttonous than the people in the Northwest. They just probably eat more fried food. That's part of their culture. So the paradigm is shifting from 1996. And here we are, fast forward to 2006. And now we see that activation of toll-like receptor 4 is associated with insulin resistance in adipocytes, and that free fatty acids might be an important causative link between chronic inflammation and metabolic disorders via toll-like receptor 4. An innate immune response plays a role in metabolic diseases, including obesity and insulin resistance. Moreover, in July 2007, a nice headline, metabolic endotoxemia, having too much endotoxin in the blood, too much product from a bacterial, gram-negative bacteria, will initiate obesity and insulin resistance. Insulin resistance favors hyperinsulinemia, and excessive hepatic and adipose tissue lipid storage, and a chronic infusion of a very low rate of lipopolysaccharide increases body weight, and they showed this in mice. This, they noted, was not, this increase in body weight was not due to excessive energy intake. So it's not that the mice ate more, but because they infused them constantly with lipopolysaccharide and caused their body a certain upgrade of their inflammatory thermostat, they developed insulin resistance, and obesity followed. And of course now, 2011, we're learning more and more about the capacity of various foodstuffs to induce innate immune activation, and not a huge surprise, pro-inflammatory stimulants of TLR2 and TLR4 were present in many food common to the Western diet, mainly meat products and processed foods. Stimulants were minimal or undetectable in fresh fruit and vegetables. Interesting. We're finally getting the data to support what our great-grandparents always told us, right? So one of the books that was really instrumental in my researching this topic in the literature was a book by Michael Pollan, In Defense of Food. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Michael Pollan. He's really been a very strong advocate for us getting back to basics and back to nature in the way that we eat. And if I want to be more practical in my advice, I would tell you some of the things that he says, which namely, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Eat what your great-grandmother would recognize as food. Eat whole or intact food. Eat food with fewer ingredients. Eat less animal products. Shop at farmers markets or at the periphery of grocery stores. Seek dietary complexity. About 70% of our caloric intake comes from corn, wheat, and soy. And the animals that we eat are fed exactly the same thing. So we are made up of corn, wheat, and soy. And if I took a sample of anyone's hair here, it's very likely that between 60 and 80% of your carbon makeup comes from corn. There's no complexity in our diet. Our immune system is geared towards making a lot of mistakes. The way we recognize self versus not self is a mechanism that has gone array. So seek dietary complexity. Eat food that is natural to a food chain. If you eat a cow, you want that cow to eat grass because you don't eat grass. So you want to get the phytonutrients from the grass through the cow and into your body. And if you eat eggs, you want to get eggs from hen that were fed seeds and worms and were free range and were able to feed on things that are within the food chain, so at least you benefit from the things that you yourself don't eat. Simply, we should eat more at home, and we cannot trust restaurants nowadays. And if you do go to restaurants, challenge them. Be that annoying customer like I am, and ask them, what kind of oil do you use? And other questions, what kind of cream do you use? Stop eating before you're full. And this is something we know from research that's currently done around the world on what's called blue zones. And the blue zones are areas where the most number of centenarians live. One of those blue zones is in Okinawa, Japan, and there are several other ones in the Mediterranean, Sardinia. There's one in Costa Rica in the highlands, and another one right here in Loma Linda, the Seventh-day Adventists, where they have a very high number of centenarians. And this research goes and really follows not just the people's diets, but looks at their lifestyle and their spirituality and their community and their habits. What do they do that allows them to maintain activity? The people in Okinawa, for example, they have a saying, which I can't pronounce, but it says, eat until you're 80% full. Something else that they do, besides form communities of older and younger people that really go through life together, is that they sit on the floor. And the authors of the research noted that they think sitting on the floor actually gets them to exercise more. It's very hard to sit on the floor, get up and down 10 times a day without getting exercise. So we want to eat food that has co-evolved with nature. We want to eat food that our great-grandparents would recognize, and not the food that the commercial food industry is feeding us without really any rhyme or reason. So that's the first topic, and it's a big one. And I'm going to go through this because I want to get through all three root concepts. The second one is fertilizing the weeds. Okay, and fertilizing the weeds does not really, it doesn't apply to other kinds of weeds, but it's fertilizing the weeds that live within you. It's the bugs, it's the bacteria that get inside your body. The question is, when you put food in your body, you're not just feeding yourself, you're feeding everything that makes you. And it turns out that you are a lot more than you. So again, this balance of inflammation that depends on microbial signaling. We are the sum collection of all the microbes that live within our body. We are a superorganism. There are no islands between people. We are really a continent. Where you end and someone else begins is very much a gray zone. There is life all around us. The study of microbiology is one of the youngest studies in all of modern medicine. We didn't know about microbes until the 1600s when the microscope was invented. We didn't know that we are colonized with the number of bacteria that we are colonized with until 1993 when the high throughput PCR methods enabled us to sequence all the bacteria within our body. The human genome was only discovered about a decade ago. So now we're working on the human metagenome. What constitutes all the genes in our body? And what we're noting is really, if this is the microbiome, this is you, the black part. These are human cells. The rest are all bacterial cells. There are about 100 trillion bacterial cells living within our body. We are only about 10 trillion cells. If you look at the genes, we are this dot right here. That's the human genome. This would encompass the entire microbiotic genome within us. So we are colonies of creatures, and we're colonized by creatures in the most uninhabitable places, like our stomach, about 1,000 cells per gram in the stomach, to the most highly inhabited habitat anywhere in the world, which is our colon. 10 to the 9, about 1 trillion cells per gram of bacteria in the colon. So what do these bugs do for us? Well, they help us with a lot of different functions. They help us digest food, they ferment food residue, starches, they help us assimilate certain nutrients. They also help us detoxify things like antibiotics, which are xenobiotics, they're external chemicals. They also have byproducts, some of them are good for us, like vitamins, vitamin K and vitamin vitamin B, biotin, and folic acid. And they certainly also produce certain metabolites that can be bad for us, like indoles that can cause cancer, like colon cancer. And as I mentioned, they're also very important for immunity. They process antigens and they help us recognize self from foreign. Lastly, they also mediate inflammation in the body through these pattern recognition receptors that I mentioned. So the microbiota engage pattern recognition receptors, and they instruct the immune system to either mitigate tissue repair, or if a pathogen invades or picks up some kind of a virulent gene, it can cause inflammation. And what we want the microbiota to help us do is to help us prevent pathogen invasion and to also help us reverse inflammation and enable cellular differentiation, various biological terms. But the advancement in our modern medical field has really allowed us to create a fingerprint of each individual microbiome. And nowadays we're able to take a sample from your mucosa or even a sample of stool and put it through a high-throughput PCR and actually get some kind of a finger-like print. These are called phylogenetic trees. And you see that the phylogenetic trees of these three individuals really have similar branches, but they're a little different on the leaves, at the very edges. These are called the core microbiome versus the variable microbiome. And the core microbiome is really what makes us us. And the variable is something that we would pick up depending on who we associate with, who we talk to, where we travel, what kind of food we eat, and other things. And we see that really the majority of us are consistent, in the colon especially, about 98% of the bacteria belong to either Firmicutes or Bacteroidetes. So here's the core human microbiome, and this is the variable, which is affected by our lifestyle, including diet, by our host pathobiology, including infection and illness, our environment, such as travel, transient community members, certain hitchhikers like viruses and protozoa, and also our physiology, including our bowel habits. And in 2006, after we had this jump in technical capacity, we have discovered that, yes, indeed, there is an obesity-associated gut microbiome with an increased capacity for energy harvest. This was published in Nature in 2006. They devoted a large part of this journal to this topic. Most of the research came out of Washington University by Jeffrey Gordon and his crew. And what they noticed is that there is a dynamic linkage between adiposity and microbes. Obese individuals harbor populations of gut microbes that enhance energy harvest from food, and that calorie absorption is not uniform amongst individuals. We don't absorb everything we eat. Certainly we know that there is that one annoying person who can eat whatever they want and they always stay thin, and you hate them. And there are those people who say, I barely eat anything and I'm still getting so big. And that has to do not just with I have a fast metabolism, I have a slow metabolism. It really has to do with a lot of different things. One of them is, how much food do you really absorb? So here's some of the data. Now, this is done in mice, okay? There is a human study I'll show you as well. These are short-chain fatty acids. They're byproducts of residue fermentation by bacteria. Things like acetate, propionate, and butyric acid. And you see that lean mice versus obese mice have different rates of production of these short-chain fatty acids. So for example, the obese mice are just much more efficient at fermenting food. Likewise, here they did a bound calorimetry of feces from the mice, and you see that the lean mice simply had more calories left over in their stool versus the obese mice. And in this case, they took donor stool, don't try this at home, and they took germ-free wild-type mice. It's a way to actually keep mice germ-free in certain germ-free environments. And then they did fecal transplants, you know, kind of gross, but we can do that with mice. They noted that after fecal transplants of wild-type, that's the plus, versus the OB, the leptin-deficient obese mice, you see that the mice that received fecal transplants from obese mice gained a lot more weight. They actually managed to reproduce the obesity syndrome by doing fecal transplants of nude mice. And this is the study they did in humans, obese versus lean humans. They took 12 individuals, a small study. They put them through a calorie-restricted, regular Mediterranean diet designed to enable those individuals to lose weight. And as these individuals managed to lose weight over the course of the year, they showed that their ratio of Firmicutes to Bacteroidetes actually changed. The number of Bacteroidetes increased as those individuals became leaner, and the number of Firmicutes decreased. So nowadays we're able to apply this to other diseases. And one that I deal with a lot is inflammatory bowel disease, where there is inflammation in the colon or the small bowel, and we see it in both pediatrics and adults. We've seen a rise in the incidence of inflammatory bowel disease, and although we still don't have a smoking gun, and we've always been looking for the one bacteria or the one pathogen that triggers this inflammatory cascade that certain genetically predisposed individuals can't turn off. But it turns out there is no smoking gun. It's not a single pathogen. It's an aberrant community of pathogens. It's a dysregulated or dysbiotic community of bacteria. And those that have Crohn's disease seem to be a constellation on the outside, on the outskirts of the universe, where ulcerative colitis and healthy lie elsewhere. So it's very possible that one day we'll be able to really distinguish how the microbiota contributes to disease, and maybe we can nurse those individuals back to health by actually modifying their intestinal bacteria. And of course, we know that food shapes the microbiome. They eat what you eat. And therefore, the second concept has to do with getting enough probiotic foods, prebiotic foods, and symbiotic foods. Well, probiotics are simply healthy bacteria that promote health. A lot of fermented food will have probiotic bacteria in it. Prebiotics is just a fancy word for fiber, because really food that promotes healthy bacterial populations is very rich in resistant starch, and we'll talk about what those are. The symbiotic is just a combination of pro and prebiotics. And the effect of probiotics are really quite numerous. And to go through this quite quickly, one of the things that they do is they produce lactic acid, which lowers the stool pH and creates a certain habitat that favors healthy bacteria. They also produce certain bacteriocins, which are microcidal and help protect us from invasion. They help or influence the production of mucins, or mucoproteins that create a certain barrier within our mucosa, preventing pathogen binding and colonization by pathogens. They influence the production of certain enzymes, which can improve digestion, something like lactase. One of the first things we used to use probiotics for back in the 70s is for people who were lactase deficient, which creates lactose intolerant. And getting back those probiotics into their body actually enabled them to digest lactose better. The production of certain short-chain fatty acids, which we mentioned, which are really healthy for the mucosal cells, and other functions, including immune conditioning. One of the things that I think a lot of people relate to with probiotics is for prevention of urinary tract infection. And I've gotten this question before in the past: how is it that eating probiotics or eating yogurt prevents recurrent urinary tract infection? How does the bacteria make it from there to there? Well, it doesn't. The bacteria that you ingest through yogurt doesn't make it into your urinary tract. It's that it stimulates a systemic response with the secretion of IgA. And secretory IgA then circulates through the body and finds its way to the genitourinary tract, where it can opsonize and neutralize bacteria. So there is a systemic effect to ingesting probiotics. It's not just local. And the medical application of probiotics is really quite numerous, from infectious diseases to inflammatory bowel disease, constipation, steatohepatitis, which is a form of inflammatory liver disease that results from the metabolic syndrome and obesity, and as well as vascular disease and atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis is not just passive congestion of the arteries. It's not just a disease where you have a clot or a cholesterol type of clot block an artery. It's an inflammatory process within the endothelial cells, which we believe also depends on innate immunity and bacteria. So there is a process that causes arteries to clot. So prebiotics, again, are non-digestible food ingredients that stimulate the growth or activity of health-promoting bacteria and digestive system, and the fermentation of prebiotics seems to increase bifidobacteria species. It increases fecal weight, shortens intestinal transit time, lowers the blood lipids, increases calcium absorption, lowers ammonia load, amongst others. And the main sources of prebiotics, or the main prebiotics, are inulin, oligosaccharides, pectin, resistant starch, grain husk, and things that are really found in plant foods. So root vegetables are probably the richest in prebiotics. Things like chicory, yam, agave, carrot, beet, onion, garlic, leeks. We probably don't eat enough root vegetables in our diets. We all love potatoes. Well, you can make a very nice root mash by adding a few carrots or a few parsnips or turnips to a mashed potatoes. Beets go great in salad, red beets. Give it a lot of flavor, better than what any dressing will. You can also add beans. Red kidney beans go great in salad. So do sunflower seeds. But, you know, people need to think of new ways of adding flavor to their food and incorporate these simple elements to create a more robust microecology in their body. So certainly, pretty much all the vegetables contain some resistant starch. Whole grains, legumes, fruit, nuts, seeds, and dried fruit. And really all can make great snacks and should be incorporated into everyone's diet. The last concept I call starving the masses. Remember, feeding the fire, fertilizing the weeds, starving the masses. I want you to go away with those three and think about it. Starving the masses has to do with how our bodies are in a state of being overfed yet undernourished. We're getting so many calories, and so many macronutrients, fat, carbs, and protein. But are we really getting all the micronutrients we need in order to neutralize disease? We're seeing such an epidemic of cancer. I mean, we all have cancer all the time. Cancer is a genetic mutation within a single cell that goes crazy and ends up multiplying before the immune system can recognize it and neutralize it. Well, maybe we're not enabling our immune system with the right phytochemicals and phytonutrients to neutralize the cancer. Certainly, we all know corn's healthy. I mean, it's a whole food. And wheat is as well. Soy is extremely healthy. The protein element of soy is very rich in branched-chain amino acids, very good quality protein, and goes straight to the muscles. But somehow modern nutritionism has managed to take these three wholesome foods, strip them down into their basic elements, and put them all back together in a very tasty Twinkie, which doesn't have any of the nutritional value of their components. So we want to look beyond the macronutrients. We want to look beyond calories. Certainly there's high quality and low quality protein. There's a nitrogen load to certain proteins. Some amino acids will contain sulfur, which is more difficult to excrete. And we want to get more branched-chain amino acids and less aromatic amino acids. And this maybe makes more sense to those of you who are really into the nutrition and diet world. There are also carbohydrates that are simple, sugar versus complex, which lowers the glycemic index of foods. And certain fats are certainly deemed better than others. Some are medium chain, which are easy to absorb, and some are long chain, which work their way into the cell membrane of each one of our cells and can either promote inflammation or actually work against it. But there is more to food than just macronutrients and calories. And the history of modern nutritionism has been a history of macronutrients at war. Protein against carbs, carbs against proteins, and then fats, fats against carbs. I mean, you constantly hear things like Atkins diet versus South Beach diet versus the Mediterranean diet. I mean, which is the right diet to eat? And we're constantly at war with the macronutrients, but I think we need to look deeper into the various diets that we advocate. So these are the various micronutrients. We all know about vitamins. Some are fat soluble, some are water soluble, various minerals and trace elements. But I don't think enough know about the various phytonutrients that are found in nature that can neutralize disease, or some of the antioxidants that can take away the stress of modern living, or even a more interesting concept that's very relevant nowadays, angiogenesis, and how cancer can use angiogenic factors to bring blood vessel to the cancer and bring blood supply and enable that cancer to spread. There are anti-angiogenic factors within food, and if we consume the right foods, we should be able to neutralize cancer on the spot. So this is nothing new. We all know that the epidemic of obesity has become overbearing, and it will corrupt this country. It will. So our country's already corrupt. It will definitely bankrupt this country. And I think that right now we're spending about $150 billion a year just to treat obesity-related illnesses. And that is likely to increase. Constantly we see about statistics regarding 1 out of every 3 Americans is going to be diabetic by the mid-century. 1 out of every 3 kids currently is overweight and at risk for obesity as an adult. I know my field in pediatric GI, and I can tell you 9.8% of children are showing signs of steatotic hepatitis. And steatotic hepatitis, as I mentioned, is an inflammatory liver disease that's related not just to how much fat we eat, but specifically to the kind of fat we eat. And kids love fast food, and they love the adulterated and industrial fats that we use to cook French fries and burgers with. And those fats are designed to have a very high smoke point, so they can stay in that fryer for 2-3 days without changing it. They're designed to have a very long shelf life, so restaurants can order a mass order, a huge order of those oils, and save a few bucks. But it turns out that when you consume those fats, our bodies don't recognize them as fat. They think it's a foreign invader, and they increase that thermostat of inflammation. And as we saw, insulin resistance drives obesity a lot more than we used to think or realize. So Colorado was the last state in 2009 to have an obesity rate that was less than 25%. We don't have that anymore. And about 12 states currently have obesity rates greater than 30%. And more than 20 have obesity rates that are greater than 25%. So this is spreading. And I actually think we have maybe plateaued a little bit. Current research shows that the data has plateaued. I'm hoping that we can start reversing the trend soon. So when we're overfed and undernourished, there is a history to it. When we started refining wheat and rice in Africa and in China, there was an epidemic of beriberi, which is thiamine or vitamin B1 deficiency. And until they realized that they could actually correct this by giving people vitamin B1 to reverse the beriberi. Same thing with pellagra, which is a niacin or vitamin B3 deficiency. And they did that. They created this disease when they started refining wheat and gave it to the population in Africa. So the question is, are we going to find out that what we're eating nowadays also is deficient in not maybe vitamin B1, 2, 3, or vitamin C, which probably is deficient in vitamin C, but other things that are so important to maintain our health. One thing we know is that intake of daily multivitamins has not been shown to decrease morbidity or prolong longevity. So, eating a burger at a greasy fast food restaurant and then going home to take a multivitamin is not going to offset the effects of that greasy burger. I mean, you better do other things. Obesity-related disorders arise with consumption of a modern Western diet. We know that from watching immigrants go from developing countries to developed countries, and they actually assume the predisposition of the present community. Obesity is an inflammatory syndrome notable for nutritional deficiencies and end organ dysfunction. As someone who works with obese individuals, and especially obese kids, I can tell you I measure their micronutrient levels, vitamin levels, and mineral levels, and they're low. They're low. One thing that we know we're low on is vitamin D. And I'm just going to use this as an example because I think it's gained a lot of notoriety that rates of osteoporosis and osteopenia continue to rise despite the fact that we're drinking more milk than ever. So why is it that they're telling us, drink your milk, it's good for your bones? It hasn't been. Milk hasn't done anything for our bones. We're drinking more milk than ever. If you look at any packaged food, it will have dairy protein in it. And yet we're not getting the vitamin D that we need. Vitamin D is only found in 4 foods: fish, egg yolk, mushrooms, but specifically mushrooms that have been exposed to light, and dairy. And vitamin D is extremely important. It's the only, well, first of all, a little bit of history. It's the only vitamin that functions as a hormone. And in fact, it's the first micronutrient that's ever been discovered. And it was discovered because you can't ignore rickets. And when you see kids with bowed legs and short stature and weak hearts who die during the Industrial Revolution because of lack of exposure to the sunlight, you have to figure out what's causing this disease. And And this person, Sir Mallenby of King's College in 1919 discovered that cod liver oil reversed rickets in dogs kept indoors. This is another great example where science followed clinical observation. The clinical observation that Sir Mallenby made was that the kids in France weren't getting rickets because the moms were feeding their kids cod liver oil, where the kids in England were not getting cod liver oil. So he had dogs indoors that he was doing research on who were all getting rickets because they weren't exposed to the lights and they were getting a diet that was deficient in vitamin D. He gave those dogs cod liver oil and managed to prevent and reverse rickets. And then he went on to isolate vitamin D as the fat-soluble component of cod liver oil. You know, but rickets is noted in ancient history as well, and Herodotus wrote about this well before the turn, before modern times, describing Persian warriors as having softer skulls than Egyptian warriors, and even then he attributed it to the wearing of turbans. Maybe it protected them from the sun. Hippocrates also described a similar affliction in 130 AD. So vitamin D is a hormone, and it binds a certain receptor that's found in the nucleus, and it turns on certain genes and turns off other genes. And one of the things we know it's very important for is skeletal mineralization, but it also prevents hypocalcemia, and it's present in cells of many tissues, including skin, skeleton, marrow, and gut. Now, vitamin D deficiency, you know, there is deficiency and there is insufficiency, and it's very possible that we do have a pandemic of insufficiency. And certain studies have shown that vitamin D deficiencies conjures an increased risk to cancer and certain autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis. And in some studies, like this study out of Boston and Pittsburgh, they noted a deficiency rate in neonates between 10 and 65%. In infants, about 10%. And this study out of Philadelphia and Athens, Georgia, between 68 and 75% of the population had low levels of vitamin D. So we're overfed and undernourished. We're obese, and yet we're deficient in certain very essential micronutrients. And a lot of people ask me, well, I take my calcium. But it turns out vitamin D is even more important than calcium because vitamin D regulates calcium absorption in the duodenum. And in this study, which is out of 2009, you see these are quartiles of calcium intake. But these are vitamin D levels. And you see that if you were in the highest quartile of calcium intake but had a low vitamin D level, you weren't as well off as the person who had the high vitamin D level but was taking the least amount of calcium. So getting vitamin D is in a sense more important for your skeletal strength and for your bones than your calcium intake. So lastly, a lot of people say, but I'm not obese. I eat what I want, and I love sausage egg McMuffin, and I'm going to have it every morning, even if my big brother tells me not to. And I say that there is such a thing as normal weight obesity syndrome, and we're seeing it now. And you may actually harbor the same exact risk factors for modern diseases, for the same chronic disabling diseases, being of normal weight as you would if you were overweight, if your diet consists of the same elements that feed the fire, fertilize the weeds, and starve your body. And in this study, we see that normal weight obesity versus pre-obese or obese patients had higher levels of tumor necrosis factor and interleukin-6, more so than non-obese controls. So I want to show you this video. If you can turn on the volume. And not that. So we tested this before. How many of you knew that Bill Clinton was eating a plant-based whole food diet?
Protein supplement every morning.
Can we remind him of that?
No dairy.
So this is a recent interview with Wolf Blitzer, who asked him, how'd you lose so much weight?
Mason, the short answer is, I went on essentially a plant-based diet. I live on beans, legumes, vegetables, fruit. I drink a protein supplement every morning. No dairy. I drink almond milk mixed in with fruit and a protein powder, so I get the protein for the day when I start the day out. And it changed my whole metabolism, and I lost 24 pounds. And I got back to basically what I weighed in high school. But I did it for a different reason. But I mean, I wanted to lose a little weight, but I didn't dream this would happen. I did it because after I had this stent put in, I realized that even though it happens quite often that after you have bypasses, you lose the veins because they're thinner and weaker than arteries. The truth is that it clogged up, which means that the cholesterol was still causing buildup in my vein as part of my bypass. And thank God I could take the stents. I don't want it to happen again. So I did all this research and I saw that 82% of the people since 1986 who have gone on a plant-based, no dairy, no meat of any kind, no chicken, turkey. I eat very little fish. Once in a while I'll have a little fish, not often. If you can do it, 82% of the people who've done that have begun to heal themselves. Their arterial blockage cleans up. The calcium depositor in their heart breaks up. This movement has been led by a doctor named Caldwell Esselstyn at the Cleveland Clinic, Dean Ornish, you know, out in California. The doctors Campbell, father and son, who wrote the China study, and a handful of others. But we now have 25 years of evidence. And so I thought, well, since I need to lose a little weight for Chelsea's wedding, I'll become part of this experiment. I'll see if I can be one of those that can have a self-clearing mechanism. We'll see.
I hope you're healthy for many years and get to see grandchildren for many years.
Me too. That's really the big deal. You know, Hillary and I, we're happy. We love our son-in-law. We admire him, and we'd like to be around if there's grandkids. We want to be there to do our part.
Mr. President, good luck.
Thank you.
Thanks for what you do.
So what former president is really doing is putting himself on an anti-inflammatory diet. He's doing it in an extreme manner, but he's able to reverse disease because he's dialing down that thermostat of inflammation in his body, and he's eating a nutrient-dense, calorie-sparse diet. And really, we need to incorporate more of that into how we eat on a daily basis. We may not be as perfect as Clinton, but hopefully we don't have disease that we're trying to reverse. Rather, we have disease that we're trying to prevent. And when we say a plant-based diet, it doesn't mean that you need to be a vegetarian or a vegan, but base your diet on plants. Instead of snacking on those ranch Doritos on the TV, I want to see you snacking on some pistachios, almonds, or sunflower seeds, pumpkin seeds, an avocado with some ground flaxseed. It's delicious. Instead of having, you know, I mean, I'll never give up ice cream. I think that's one of the reasons to live. But certainly I've been able to give up milk as I've shifted more to almond milk and rice milk and even goat milk. And what I do is a little combination of the three. And I really, when I put it in cereal, I don't really notice a difference. Instead of eating oatmeal with sugar, I sweeten it with honey. I add a banana or some blueberries. So it's small changes that you can make to pack your body with more nutrients, make it a nutrient-dense diet that's sparse in calories and sparse also in industrial components. And just to finish up with some healthy habits that I like to drive home. Certainly it's easy to say eat less, exercise more, but I think that's really failed. I think that what we've been preaching as physicians for the past 30 years has not gotten our society to where we want to be. So I think now we have to say, don't just eat less, exercise more, let's focus on eating different. And certainly eating to 80% full I think is wise, or eating slowly and letting the feeling of satiety kind of rise, but also leave room for dessert. I think dessert is too tasty to be over full for. And have fruit for dessert. We always have cake or cookies or ice cream, but try to find ways to put some fruit every day on the table, and I think dessert is a great time to do that. Snack between meals. Don't enter your meals too hungry. It's okay to snack in between and then enter a meal and eat less. And make sure those snacks are healthy. Fruit, nuts, seeds, a vegetable. But snack between meals. It will keep your metabolism up. It will keep your thermogenesis up. And it will allow you to eat less during your meal. A vegetable with every meal. I tell it to my kids, but I don't think the parents do it. So it doesn't help me to tell my kids, I want you to eat your vegetables with every meal if the parents really don't do it themselves. Please drink water. You know, the osmolarity of Diet Coke is 690. The osmolarity of the blood is about 300. How is that going to rehydrate you? I mean, if you're drawing fluid from your body to, it's got to be a treat. I love Diet Coke too, but with meals, drink water. And if it's a Diet Coke, have it be a treat. Don't walk around with Diet Coke bottles I did when I was a resident all day long in your white coat. I think drinking water is one of the best medical nutrients we have, and certainly some green tea as well. Eat at home, incorporate raw food, less inflammatory. Once you cook food, you kind of change it a little bit. Certainly want to be aware of certain diseases that go along with raw food, listeria with raw milk, but incorporating some like raw nuts, raw cashews, raw almonds, raw seeds can certainly be beneficial. Avoid fast food restaurants at all costs, especially if you're already trying to reverse some kind of a condition like diabetes or heart disease. As for takeaway containers when you go to restaurants, and split your meals ahead of time. Even before you start, they bring you such big dishes, portions. Ask for a to-go container and split it right off the bat. Oftentimes you'll be glad you'll have something extra to get to a little bit later on in the evening. Avoid industry processed oils. Corn oil and soybean oil are probably the worst. Avoid the high fructose corn syrup and added sugars if you can, and avoid packaged foods that have more than 5 ingredients. So I think this is it and I'm done. Thank you very much for having me. And actually, Dean Ornish and Caldwell Esselstyn, as well as T. Colin Campbell's The China Study. I brought all 3 of their books here so you can see them. I brought a few books that have really inspired me in my research. And I think that as a gastroenterologist, I hope that I was able to bring something new to the table beyond the obvious cardiology folks here, what you guys already know. Thank you.
Do you recommend that people do a colon cleanse in order to lose weight?
Well, I recommend a colonoscopy because that's the best care. And I can guarantee that. I've never done it. I've heard people swear by it. Again, I do it not every day, but that's kind of my job. And I definitely see some of the gunk that accumulates in the cecum. Sometimes it's really hard to get off. I mean, you're washing it like power washing it, you put your foot on that little pedal and you see the water squirting out and it's gunk that I can't imagine anything removing, not even a deep colon cleanse. So my recommendation would be get on a diet that's very rich in fiber and resistant starch. Take a probiotic if you feel like you're harboring extra bacteria. And get your bowels moving faster. Train your bowels. I tell my kids too, a river that flows fast flows clean. You wouldn't drink from a pond, but you would, So the idea is that gut that moves fast is going to move cleaner. And we are kind of a hollow, it's a hollow organ. And from top to bottom, we have a river that flows through us. So keeping regularity is one of the best signs of health.
Thanks so much, Dr.